Today we're going to be discussing anti-racist bigotry and the liberalistic tendency, especially nowadays, to be a little bit more totalitarian and its metaphysical backing of materialism, generally speaking. The values of liberalism are not able to be defended in a realistic worldview. The same individuals who preach for individuality and equality usually they fail to acknowledge the simple truth that human nature cannot be stripped away from us and you cannot will away inborn instincts. The world, as well as life, is simply dominated by power and vitality, not weakness or moral superiority. A world where liberalism can truly flourish and survive for long periods of time, in a sense, requires a totalitarian globalist government to rule such an apparent, in liberals' minds, utopia. This is because, in the grand scheme of history, societies that generally move away from warrior culture are almost always conquered by a more vital, barbarian-like force that is more grounded in the inherent truths of life. Therefore, a liberal society will generally fall to a more warrior-like conquering or conquered-based opposition unless it can harness its men with propaganda, of course, to fight in their name, usually boosting morale through nationalism, which is pretty ironic, especially in the past few wars. And in recent history, invaders aren't being fought by militaries. They're instead being fought over diplomatically and are being invited in a lot of cases. So in order for liberalism to survive, it must be, in a sense, totalitarian due to its death by empathy tendency to invite in people who don't even like the ideology, the same ideology that allowed for them to come in. This control that liberalism requires in order to actually survive is an oxymoron within the ideology itself, as it believes all people should be allowed to express themselves how they want to. Well, great. So what if people decide to express themselves that are in opposing ways to liberal ideas? Well, that can't be had, because if everybody starts doing that, liberalism falls. So therefore, the liberal has to take a morally superior standing in order to govern everybody else, and hence suppress opposing ideologies to an extent, which is against the very ideology they are wishing to protect. This would require, of course, total control of all information with a heavy restriction of ideas that inherently oppose liberalism, which is more ideologies than you think, as most ideologies are usually dogmatic. If opposing ideologies were allowed to be discussed, eventually a revolution would take place, as people would eventually realize how flawed liberalism is and how it kind of needs totalitarianism to exist, and therefore they'd wish to overtake it. Liberals are tolerant to those who want to rape and murder their children, but not to those who, on an ideological level, oppose them. They tend to claim that everything is relative, including morality, but when it comes to moral debates, the liberals claim they are morally superior. Well, I thought it was relative and subjective. That only holds until someone disagrees with them. It's the same sort of thinking when it comes to my body, my choice. Well, it's my body, so I can do what I want with it. Okay, great. Well, unless it's at a detriment to somebody else. Yep. The levels at which propaganda has infiltrated these people's minds without them being able to take a step back or, ironically enough, consider other people's perspectives and look at the greater picture is astonishing. And about perspectives, they will constantly want us to think about the perspective of a child born to an illegal immigrant and what it must feel like to be in that situation. Okay, how about you consider the perspective of the thousands of Native girls that have been raped and killed, one or two of them possibly by that same child's father? Or perhaps the perspective of the Native man who has watched his country's culture and identity be stripped away from what it had been in the name of importing third worlders who actively shit in his street and dream of raping his granddaughter in the name of Allah. And if he interjects, he'll, in some countries, go to jail or lose his job, or, oh no, he might be called racist. This is the active invading of a more barbaric force that I discussed earlier. It just goes past most people's minds because it's not done militarily through violence and weapons, but instead culturally and diplomatically. The nature of liberalism will be the reason liberalism fails. Its values see unrestricted immigration as a virtue. This same immigration will be the very downfall of the liberal society. The modern world has gone away from needing to physically invade a society with weapons and armies. Instead, now countries can be invaded through religiously dogmatic immigrants. Such country had its doors opened by the same ideology it was trying to defend. It has to tell the immigrants, hey, you have the freedom to do you, but also You have to do it without restriction, dogmatism, or oppression of others. The biggest issue being is places such as London are projected to be a far majority Islamic population within the next few decades. So it's not ridiculous to assume such Islamism will be seen with Britain's politics, opening the doors for an Islamic state of Britain in the near future. This will rid of any liberalistic backing seen in the government unless capitalists can subdue the Islamic populace, which could occur. But these same immigrants are being invited under the lie that they will boost the economy, or that, of course, diversity is our strength, even though economies are not being boosted. Immigrants are, at least for now, a financial burden to these countries, almost always being a great net negative. And let's say they were a positive even. Is a perceived material-based economy really more important than a nation's people? Should we turn to slave labor in order to compete with China because it'll make our economy better? Should we rid people of any non-material values in order to have them succumb to the system a little bit easier? Once you intellectualize metaphysics, you turn it into numbers and artificial, nihilistic, meaningless garbage with no way of implementing any actual real theory. Such issue is struggled with by vague conservatives or individuals who value economic prosperity over all else, which is ironic as economic prosperity for the native individual is negatively correlated to the increase of immigration, of course, just due to the way job markets work, the way housing markets work. When you have more immigrants, you need a place to live. There's the same amount of houses. Price of housing goes up with the more immigrants, same with jobs. Liberalism, of course, replaces ethics and economics in the place of politics. Liberals think a utopia of world peace and no war is possible when it just isn't. From a liberal standpoint, it is their duty to go around the world and stop war and reduce suffering. This means that they have to label everything that isn't liberal as an enemy. And then they'll use human rights and stretch it as far as they need to dictate what an enemy is and what isn't, even going to the extent of saying this country on the other side of the world from where liberalism propped up has a completely different culture, religion, customs, everything from me, but they're not getting along with my ideology that I created 300 years ago. Therefore, I have to go in there and try to forcibly fucking change them. And it's crazy. It just doesn't work. I couldn't tell you why. It's almost like these people, you just can't do that. And that in itself, that going to other parts of the world and trying to do things like that proves that liberalism needs globalistic totalitarianism to exist. Because when those same people reject liberalism and democracy like they've always done so far, the liberal goes, fuck, well, we got to go back. You know, that's pretty totalitarian. They saw your liberal ideas and they went, no, go fuck yourself. We want to go back to our whatever Islamic State. We'll use Iran, Afghanistan, all that stuff. If we want to go back to this, I'm sorry. Jihadists came in and they don't agree with liberalism, it turns out. So we gotta go back. And then the liberals go, well, no, now we gotta go back and fight them again. You see, they need globalism and they need a sense of totalitarianism because these people have other ideas that they made upon themselves. Let's say a liberal country is at war with a non-liberal country. Liberal country wins. But liberal country feels as though it needs to liberate non-liberal country. So it invades. Now take the same concept and use it until the entire world is under a one-world government. This same idea is basically what the USSR and in some ways the US also wanted to do and to an extent did. It thought communism was the greatest thing ever, so it could invade whoever and kill 100 million people because clearly communism is good. Obviously, 100 million people, gulags, it's a great thing. The metaphysical backing behind all that I've discussed so far tends to generally originate from a capitalistic, liberalistic, nihilistic, and henceforth materialist and individualist perspective. Such ideas, especially when combined, dehumanize practically everybody besides victims who are overrepresented and given constant pity, while also viewing all of humanity as numbers who can be milked for capital gain. Such numbers, also known as people, are stripped of any sort of God and told through constant propaganda and all forms of media what to believe and think, even if on a rational level, the backings behind such propaganda are immensely flawed due to truth, which turns out to not be subjective, you fucking retard. Such indoctrination generally leads to an inherent nihilism within the individual, priming them for wage slavery in some sort for the system. Nihilism stems from individualism, usually, because my individual freedom is more important than everyone else. If I'm mortal and have no greater purpose, I better indulge in all that only I want to do. Fuck everybody else before me. Fuck everybody else after me. Why defend anything or build anything when only I matter? And this is the rot of liberalism, and it's seen in boomers who often don't care about the future. Because I hear this a lot. This is what they say when you bring up something in the future. Well, I'll be dead by then. There you go. Within a progressive materialist view, this is an entirely acceptable phenomenon. And the better it can be perpetuated without the individual's knowledge, the better. This is exaggerated through the importation of desperate immigrants, as their life at a baseline is already so much better in the first world country that they will succumb to anything and do anything in order to get there, which therefore lowers the standards for our politicians. The Enlightenment's natural rights are purely a daydream. In the natural world, these rights aren't natural or guaranteed, but they are earned. It's fiction, a dangerous delusion that doesn't, in bad scenarios, allow us to realize our true human nature. We need to realize our nature instead of ignoring it and trying to move past it. Liberalism weakens societal bonds. Liberalism cannot defend its own values because of its values. Muslims cannot adopt liberal values if they are truly Muslim because natural rights are not innate. Liberalism has no defense against those who operate tribally, which is common in human nature. Humans tend to operate tribally. We tend to be around people that we want to be around. That's generally the most comfortable, regardless of race, regardless of upbringing. People want to be around their own people. We need a sense of collectivism that liberalism doesn't offer. Liberalism refuses to acknowledge that pain, suffering, and war are innate to human nature. Liberalism instead thinks that we can rid of them in order to achieve a natural state of freedom. But we are finding out that that is simply wrong. Nature doesn't have any morals or rights, it simply does what it does. It may be fertile and beautiful next day, war, anarchy, and chaos another. We cannot be in control of this force, instead we are puppets of it. That doesn't mean that morality, of course, isn't inborn into us through nature and through a sense of evolution. It just means that nature as a whole, regarding all of the species and all of the acts that take hold in nature, are not subject to morals or rights. It doesn't mean the humans are not subject to it, because they of course are. They're of course, in my opinion, inborn morals to humans. We must stop being so naively idealistic and confront the truths of our sometimes horrific existence. If we continue on our current trajectory, in the next few hundred years, it is possible that we will lead to a near extinction event unless major changes occur. This is what accelerationist pray for. But we have new knowledge of ancient civilizations that are beginning to change our entire perspective of humanity's history. You, of course, have the ancient pyramids that were built about 5,000 years ago with extreme precision. And in order to get this extreme precision, of course, along with many other factors, they had to have technology that we simply lost or have not found. These are cycles of history that occur. Technological advancements combined with capitalistic endeavors will probably lead to the mass populace being increasingly enslaved over the next few hundred years. The natural Darwinistic way of evolving will become so skewed, or in a sense not skewed at all, that humans will eventually become infertile, or the elite will be the last to remain, as true humans have will have merged with technology or be products of genetic engineering in order to make more efficient slaves. The elite are still humans with the same issues that human nature endows on them too, which will lead to a sort of fall amongst them as well. All of this that I've discussed, combined with progressive ideologies, will also weed out those who are strong, fertile, and not soy boys, which over generations will lead to a populace of men who are infertile and who are basically mentally and physically castrated. We are to an extent, on a light level, already seeing this. The only option if we wish to keep the species alive is to return to nature and forget the ideals of progressivism, liberalism, and anything regarding a monetary system. Any failure to do this will down the line result in extinction in some way, shape, or form. We are better off reverting back to a civilization that knows nothing of technology, liberal ideology, capitalism, communism, or diversity. Nature has always been by our side forever, so we must formulate our lives and laws from the natural laws of nature and live in accordance to them instead of trying to pry our species away from it. Nature always wins in the end. It may seem like we can beat it in the short run, but if you think about it and research civilization at a large enough scale, technological advancements and social changes that are at odds with nature always detriment the society which takes them on in the long run. We are not compatible with anything that is anti-nature or anti-life. We are nature in the most literal sense. We are life. We are our ancestors. Why would we partake in ideologies that are inherently against ourselves or our people? The only thing we are progressing towards is slavery, soulless jobs, depressing environments, lifeless art, consumerism, anti-life values, and possibly extinction. Ignoring that which is the truth is like purposely putting on a blindfold because looking into the abyss makes you too uncomfortable, even though humanity and your bloodline depends on it. Or you could scratch all this and take the accelerationist pathway. This is a spiritual war that we are in. There's rampant self-hatred, the consumption of meaningless garbage, the lack of identity and community, social division and unrest, the lack of any sort of God, the blackmailed politicians, the very demon that you are watching this on. The normalization of materialism and anti-life ideologies, modernity as a whole, this is all aimed to subdue and murder your soul and spirit. Almost all of Western media idealizes and legitimizes what they call anti-racist ideologies, which we all know anti-racist also usually means anti-white. This includes diversity and race mixing to psychologically nurture anti-white sentiment. It provides moral grounding and manipulation for a non-white Eurasia while being able to psychologically subdue white resistance. The West has had rapidly imposed demographic change from the top down. White wealth is being used to pay in order to artificially elevate outsiders in vast numbers and placing them into formerly homogeneous countries. Even with this systematic transference of white people's wealth and our generosity, the benefactors still tend to hate us. Our ancestral lands that once would have to be brutally fought for are given away to these same immigrants who return the favor by destroying our culture, economy, prosperity, safety, identity, community, and all while murdering and raping our children. We are starting to become unwelcome strangers in the same cities that our ancestors built for us. Places of power are then artificially granted to these invaders through things like DEI, affirmative action, and then they use it to empower only their own people through things like nepotism. Our forefathers had a mindset that is foreign to ours today. They used to look at the things that they did and ask themselves, why am I doing this? And the answer to that was, I am doing this for my children. I am doing this for the betterment of my civilization and my people, and for the benefactor of my offspring. That is why they crossed oceans and built something out of absolutely nothing just to shortly die after. It wasn't for them. They had a greater purpose than just their lives. And that same spirit and those same countries that are built by those kind of people are now being invaded and are being given away to immigrants who have absolutely no respect at any degree for the country they live in or the people that live there. The natives raised through propaganda to value humanitarianism, generosity, and selfless empathy, especially to those who preach victimhood, then have to compete against those who view such qualities as weakness that should be exploited. Meanwhile, their hatred for us is seen as justified resentment. We are constantly told that no matter what we do and how much we give for their benefit, it's not enough. The natives face decline and extinction if trends continue. This engineered transformation would not have been possible without cultural programming in order to deactivate the natives' racial survival instincts. This is the primary purpose of modern Western entertainment media. It can be hard to spot to the average Joe who only pays half attention to what he's consuming because he's consuming something else as well. But once you see it everywhere. Every piece of media in the 21st century contains this very theme alongside others. When threatened, regardless of race, it's natural for such peoples to mobilize in their own defense, with collective movement towards the protection of their people. The cultural controllers have been able to suppress this natural organic tribal reaction within the native population through conditioning to the point where most are in a sort of unnatural state of psychological passivity while also acting extremely submissive and oftentimes being very hateful of themselves and not having any respect for themselves either. The anti-white sentiment is designed as a treatment of Western man's natural instincts by framing such instincts as immoral and irrational, therefore implying that whites are immoral and irrational creatures. To defend your people and its extinction has, by design through propaganda, been universally deemed as immoral and evil if a white person is doing it. When a white person reads or constantly views this sort of propaganda, it subconsciously, through the use of dogmatic emotional symbolism and storytelling, subdues self-preservation or collective homogeneous preservation and often leads to self-hatred. This programming also subdues the inborn will to struggle and will to power. The natural quest for dominance and survival instead becomes the quest to discard and sacrifice ourselves to our enemy. That is how powerful this propaganda is. It has enough power to, without your knowledge, completely undermine and invert your natural instincts. You do not passively catch on to this as it's designed to mask its conscious function and intent. Once this notion has been accepted and internalized on a collective level within the society, the long-term survival of whites becomes nearly impossible. Through immense and constant propaganda, they have managed to instill this idea even though it's contrary to nature and human instinct. You either align yourself with the perceived villain and anti-white forces and feel guilty for and turn against their own kind, while the victims align themselves with the prey and feel powerless but also righteous anger. They are attempting to conquer us with ideas instead of armies. A lot of white natives tend to benefit from their ancestors through a sort of inheritance or legacy, but the media that we are shown subconsciously implies that we should be shameful of this instead of protective of it so we can give that to our children. It's best to give it away to foreigners who'd rape our children if given the opportunity. That's what the media implies. They want civilizational suicide to take hold in white countries. This propaganda can only be had through media and fiction, or else it would be too blunt. It must be subliminal and done subconsciously with symbolism and myth, or else they'd have to just say, yeah, we want white people to go extinct. Even though they never say that, most people understand that is what they're implying. And a lot of people who understand that are on their side, even though they're white, which is what I'm talking about here. It's an unconsensual call of submission to their will that most succumb to without questioning or noticing it. By globally scapegoating European descendants, world leaders unify all desperate peoples in the destruction of the white man. It's constant victim or villain. When you watch these films, you subconsciously associate with either side, depending on who you are, of course. They do not want us to unify in any way against them. They want us to hate ourselves and hate each other. World redemption through non-white Europe is the unifying global narrative, and for some people, the true religion of our time. Most liberals very clearly state that they hate white civilization and they hate Western values, especially traditional values. They daydream of these values being destroyed and replaced with progressive and radically liberal values. So why would the elites and the top people at Hollywood, the media, the world leaders, why would they all want to do this? Well, of course, there's many theories why. Most I cannot discuss on YouTube, but one that I can discuss is the immigrants' arrival being facilitated by elites and bureaucrats because modernity is causing the native population's fertility rates to plummet all the way to the point that the elite slaves, which are the native population, aren't reproducing enough to replace themselves. This diversity, of course, that is caused by the immigration causes social upsets, decline of culture, and loss of identity for the natives. So who is facilitating all this? Well, you can probably guess. It's more than likely a certain small group of international individuals who've managed to rat their way into great positions of influence through mass accumulations of wealth and blackmailing. The rational explanation of this is that these individuals by nature are of a different kind than me and you. They have a spirit in opposition to your loving human. These individuals have a tendency for greed, an almost endless pursuit of more power, more money, more enslavement for my benefit. These monsters are not like me and you. The monsters that are like me and you, still have a human side to them, but not these monsters. These monsters deceive, lie, and take the advantage regardless of any negative consequence that doesn't involve themselves. The villains that lie and deceive are almost always the worst, much worse than an honest villain. The spirit of these people is almost inborn and reflected through their religion. Ludwig Feuerbach, a relatively unknown German philosopher, excellently pointed out that a people's religion is often a reflection of themselves and the natural tendencies of their people, as well as being a projection of their consciousness. For example, most of the founders of Christianity were generally small, weak, poor slaves who needed moral justice in some way. The only way that they could get such a thing is through the dream of an afterlife where their opponent loses and they win forever. Not to say that Christianity is bad, but generally most of the creators and founders of Christianity do fit that description. You also see this with the god of Odin and Norse mythology. This was created and worshipped by the same group of Germanic peoples who had been warring and conquering each other for centuries. And the religion of the group of individuals that I'm discussing reflects them as well. I cannot go into any sort of detail for the sake of this video staying up, but you can look into their book and practices. This sort of spirit between every group of peoples influences everything that they do and have done. The spirit of these individuals is purely only about them, if it is there at all. This is why they have been allowed to flourish so well in the economic development we've experienced within the past few hundred years, especially since they controlled a major landmark of our economic system. This spirit that drives them in very self-preserving ways is generally in extreme when contrasted to the other spirits seen in other people. We need a sense of transcendent collectivism that liberalism cannot offer. Most people within a heavily liberal society believe that life has no purpose. That is because the ideology that they back their life with is individualistic, materialistic, and nihilistic. Such things lead people into depression and vulnerability due to radicalization. When individuals take a purely individualistic perspective to life, it most times leads to nihilism. We as humans cannot live purely for ourselves. We must act for an ideal or out of a sake for something. We generally tire out when we only live for ourselves. Someone that can act purely for himself regardless of his nihilism is, in my eyes, not human. What you'll notice is, when you really take a lot of time to look at it, is that all ideologies commonly accepted in the modern world are all tied to materialism. Capitalism, materialistic. Communism, materialistic. People have been propagandized into believing a society must be based upon a sort of polarity between capitalism or communism. This was the greatest trick that they have ever pulled. In either economic system, they are at the top. This is why the Cold War remained cold, whilst pushing warmongering propaganda to boost the military-industrial complex. The alternative places values within society that are fundamentally rooted in the common understanding that we have of the world and of human nature, accepting life as it is based on fundamentals that rule our existence. Natural law holds both a principle of being and becoming with an acceptance that life is a constant struggle. Natural hierarchy, domination, strength, youth, fertility, intellect, inequality, and vitality should be viewed as virtues whilst embracing a natural blood transcendence through rights proven by tradition to be effective. Attempting to exfoliate the highest form of man instead of trying to enslave everyone for your own nihilistic material gain. Embracing the natural will and exfoliating our spirit inherent to our beings. Returning to a metaphysical backing that holds some sort of non-material aspects with respects to your bloodline and your ancestors. This includes acknowledging and subduing decadence primers, such as multiculturalism and egalitarianism. This is in severe contrast to liberalism, which disregards nature and believes that we are somehow above it or separate from it, which is a disgrace. Nature has been by our side forever, and it will never leave. Liberals try to pry us away from nature and believe us all to be a blank slate at birth, which is simply incorrect. 50 to 70% of a person can be predicted on a both physiological and neurological level by genetics. This includes behavior, emotional tendencies, tendency towards violence, mannerisms, metaphysical backings, and general feelings towards others. Such a progressive society implies that victimhood is virtuous alongside weakness and nihilism while denouncing beauty, strength, or self-thinking. All of these virtues that they think are in complete opposition to what we know is truth in nature. These traits, such as beauty, strength, and thinking for yourself, tend to be pretty good. They tend to produce people that are of pretty high caliber. So denouncing them is retarded. Life is and will always remain a struggle, a war, an overcoming of a sort of resistance, with the goal being the protection and prosperity of your people. Anything that is against that is the enemy, especially in a spiritual and consumptive sense.